Welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. And I have my first guest here, John Vervaeke, my hero of the Academy, John Vervaeke, who I'm modeling this off of after Voices with Vervaeke. I was happy to be your first, I think, published guest on that.
Yep.
Reality. Yep. So we're doing a little bit of modeling there. So welcome, John.
Thank you, Gregg. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this.
Absolutely. Me too. And, you know, I thought we could talk a little bit about dialogos. Right. And maybe that gives, I'm sure the people listening to this will have a sense of you and your journey, but, you know, the emergence of dialogos kind of sets the stage for really what this whole podcast is about. So I thought maybe we could have that as a jumping off point.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'll make a distinction. I think there's a practice we can engage in, which is called dialectic.
Right.
And dialectic isn't like a recipe or an algorithm. Dialectic is a practice that can increase the chances that dialogos will take shape, right? Because the point about one of the central features of dialogos is, you know, that there's a logos that emerges between us that has a life of its own. And a way of thinking about that is, I often say, you know, we're in dialogos if we're getting to places, we're having insights that we couldn't get to individually. We somehow form, two of us or three of us or four of us. We've done this with Chris and we've done it with other people, where we get something like a collective flow state, and we get to places, we get emerging intelligibility that we couldn't get to on our own. And that has a normative value for us. It gives us guidance, both collectively and individually, in the cultivation of wisdom and trying to, you know, collect and curate and coordinate practices for overcoming self-deception and enhancing and meaning in life. So, I mean,
beautiful. Actually, we can go back. So for me now, I've internalized the concept of the base of sentience. Okay. Yeah. And the base of sentience was a dialogos moment between us on the world not.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. So you and I were on if you don't mind, I'll say it. We were doing Untangling the World Not. I approached you and you were very excited about it. And I approached you because I said, like, I want to present this material. I normally present it monologically as like a professor, listen to the word professing. And I said, I would like to present this material, but I also want to exemplify and promote, right, a different way of trying to make our way through this, namely this practice of doing it dialectically and hoping that dialogos will catch. And we were doing this thing where we were going through an argument I was making about different kinds of qualia and consciousness, and I don't even know how it started, but together we got this insight about what we came to call valence qualia. And I didn't come up with it. You didn't come up with it. We dynamically came up with it, and it plugged our work together, and then it ramified back through my work and back through your work in powerful ways. And when that happens, you feel like you're touching something. I mean, this is the Socratic idea. You feel like you're touching something sacred, something that's deeply profound and transformative.
Totally. And for me, and then it carries, it echoes. And one of the things that I hope for this process, and I mean very broadly, whatever this process is, there's a movement going on. Yeah. There's a lot of shift. For me, there was a real echo of continuity. So I held it, and then it fit, and then I metabolized it, and now it sort of grew. So it's like this diamond that emerged and then maintain resonance across a wide variety of different things. And so, you know, that's beautiful stuff. And really that doesn't come with writing. Well, I mean, you can get it somewhat writing papers, but the intersection of the dialectic, that does create a particular new context for it. And I hope that that's why I want to do this, is that it really spreads a different kind of academic inquiry. It opens up a different kind of education. It opens up a different kind of community, it seems to me.
Yes, very much. I mean, it really does. It permeates and percolates, right, in these powerful ways you're pointing to. And it changes the way in which intelligibility emerges and it also changes the way in which people have access to involvement. One of the things that I've been impressed by is other people. First of all, you get these dialogues, and then you get a meta dialogue between the various dialogues, forming a network of these. And you also get people watching it and saying that they feel like they are participating, not just spectating. And I think that's very, very important if we're going to start to get people involved in the kind of sense making that in a collective and distributed way, if we're going to address some of the thorny issues facing us right now.
Totally. In fact, I was just listening to a presentation that Zach Stein gave, and he was talking about how do we unveil the potential of the digital age. And you know, and this seems to me to be exactly what he would likely point to in relationship to if it can be channeled and organized in a particular way. But it seems to be that we are seeding that exact practice because it's face-to-face, it's engaging, it's dialogical, it can network across a wide variety of different emergent systems. And that seems to me is the kind of process that actually has a chance to make a real difference.
I agree. I think Zach's idea that we're sort of we need education in a time between worlds is deeply appropriate. We've lost the deep connections between education and enculturation, education and intergenerational transmission of wisdom. We've lost that, and we've lost it to our detriment. I agree very strongly with Zach's proposals around that.
So one of the things I'd like us to do, really sort of then frame this conversation, I'm going to throw out a concept, and then we can riff off it for the next hour or whatever. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So this is where you know this is where my heart is, and I think this is where your heart is too. So here's the idea: we are in search of a coherent naturalistic ontology that can revitalize the human soul and spirit in the 21st century.
Right. I think that's I think that's right. I think that's a good posing of the problem. I mean, in some ways, that's the central problem. I mean, on my Twitter, right, account, on my profile, I'm trying to bridge between science and spirituality. And your question, I think, is exactly right. Let me give you 1 minute for why I think that's right, because
absolutely,
I think we should talk about these practices like we've done about the practice of dialectic into dialogos. That's good. We can talk about mindfulness practices. We can talk about practices for cultivating rationality, active open-mindedness. This is all good, and we can curate them into ecologies of practices, and that's all very important. But ultimately, ecologies need a home. They need a home that sustains them, that valorizes them, that guides them. And that's what a worldview is. Right. That's what I would argue a worldview is. And there's some pretty good emerging cognitive psychology and cognitive science about worldviews. And I think what you're putting your finger on is, and this is something I think we agree on, our current worldview is not doing it. Right. Our current worldview is not doing that. And the terms you use, like the terms you use, let's look at those two terms to just an example of what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. You know, soul and spirit. They provoke one of two reactions. They provoke, oh, stop with all that woo-woo crap, right? I'm a scientist. Yep. Or they believe, oh yes, you know, and what we're talking about is we're talking about magical properties and things that, right, that I've always believed, and both of those are not helping. You're right. They're not helping with the problems. That's what I would argue. And so how can we get a worldview that homes the cultivation of what I would call wisdom and meaning in life, such that there is a intellectually, cognitively, existentially, scientifically respectable way that is not useless, but highly functioning to talk these terms, to use these terms again.
Right.
And so naturalism, to my mind, is an attempt to propose a worldview that will do just that. If I understood you correctly? Totally.
And in fact, well, yes, I add the word coherent here for a particular reason.
Of course.
You know, and what I'm speaking to is this, I believe that we have lost touch with coherentism in a particular way, as a particular kind of philosophical. I mean, Aristotle and Plato are basically coherentists in terms of the way they're thinking about philosophy. We then build the modern scientific epistemological system, and we move to a correspondent theory of truth, which is unbelievably powerful in particular ways. But it dismantles the great chain of being, and it undermines Christianity, some ways in very appropriate ways, of course. But I would argue, and I think you would agree with this, if I look out across the scientific landscape, it's a chaotic, fragmented, pluralistic landscape. The postmodernists really describe the modernist landscape pretty well.
Yeah, and so I have a short video on this, but it's actually just taken from my introductory lecture to cognitive science, which is, let's take another term related to spirit and soul. In fact, often people almost use these terms interchangeably. And I know this is a term you want to talk about, mind. So when I look at this, what I see is different disciplines talking about this in with fundamentally different ontologies, with fundamentally different epistemologies. So the neuroscientist is talking about neurons and neurodynamics, et cetera, and they're using fMRI and EEG. And then you get the machine learning person who's not talking about that at all. They're talking about neural nets or learning algorithms, and they're running simulations. Or you have the psychologist, and you know this better than I, trying to say, well, we're talking about it, the mind, but we're talking about it in behavior. And I know that's already problematic, right? And then what do they do? Well, they run experiments and they do statistical analysis. Or what about the linguist who studies the mind because the mind is carried in language? And they don't do any of these things, they do other things. Or what about the anthropologist who studies the mind as culture? And they write ethnographies and right? And so we have this completely fragmented, completely equivocal presentation of something that is supposed to be central to our self-understanding. So if I ask you what a mind is, you can't give me an integrated, unified answer. In fact, one of the things that cognitive science tries to do is to try and figure out how can we reintegrate all of these together, and I'm going to use your adjective, so we can give a coherent account of what the mind is. Because if we don't, we're going to have a fragmented, right, account of mind. It's going to lead us to equivocation, confusion. It's going to undermine our existential project of self-interpretation.
Beautiful. Basically, so I hear that and I go on my own journey, basically the exact same journey into that problem through psychotherapy. Okay?
Right.
So I get into psychotherapy and we have all of these different models. Then I ask the question, well, shouldn't psychotherapy be anchored to the science of psychology? That seems reasonable, right?
Yeah,
it's like medicine. I mean, it's got its problems, but medicine's anchored to the science of human biology. And if we're in Western science, then that sort of makes sense, right? And then I rediscover the problem of psychology and then trail it all the way back to the exact same. In 1927, Lev Vygotsky identifies the crisis of psychology.
Yeah, exactly.
And he does the exact same thing. He's got the Freudians are talking about unconscious process. The behaviorists are talking about behavioral processes. The Gestaltists are talking about precognitive processes. The functionalists and the structuralists, they're all talking about completely different ontological reference points. He doesn't use that term exactly, but basically. And we're now... And now it's a horse race between the paradigms and equivocation and talking past each other. So in 1927, it's the same. It's a replication of the same basic issue. And so this gets me to coherent naturalism, which is my basic argument is that, we're the Enlightenment with what it did and all of its beauty at one level, it gave us a really screwed up grammar for matter-mind relation.
Yes.
And it didn't help clarify. It then gives ontological and epistemological authority to science, okay? But it doesn't help us understand the relationship between science and our folk ontology and the social construction of reality.
Yes.
And so it's just a cluster of confusion. And the sciences, the physical sciences and biological sciences, they get somewhat organized. But when you get up into psychology and the cognitive sciences, we have ontological chaos.
Yes, very much. I agree with everything you just said there. And so I mean, this shows up. Well, I'm in both cognitive psychology and in cognitive science, And I see this, I love my department and I love my university and I love my discipline. So I'm not saying this as somebody from the outside, but we're suffering the replication crisis, and this is part of the fact. And many people, oh, we got to improve the statistics and lab. Yeah, do all that. But there's other people that are saying, no, we don't have an overarching framework. And what we do is, and this is what I see, we terrifically reward innovators and we disregard and ignore integrators.
Totally. Well, because because they got the empirical methodological structure gets institutionalized. Actually, you can read psychology books and essentially they say that. Well, it's like, we're interested in science and really we're interested in the operationalized methodological process of defining a research program that then yields some interesting findings and then gets you grants to produce them. I call this the sandcastle problem. Like, we build all these sandcastles that are that can be beautiful and great, but they're really anchored to a particular operational set of research paradigms, and they can build their doc students and everything. But if the next wave will come in, and the next generation will build sandcastles all over again.
Yeah, exactly. You have these very shallow ontologies and very shallow epistemologies that can't withstand, long-term scrutiny. And so, I mean, we see the rise and fall of the fads, and we see the rise and fall of constructs. Baumeister's willpower that becomes prevalent and then suffers replication issues, et cetera, et cetera. And what I've noticed is the areas of psychology that are more philosophically informed are more willing to talk to philosophical communities and pursue integration. For example, the work I do in cognitive psychology on rationality, right? You get experimental work that is robust and doesn't fall prey to the replication crisis, or a lot of the the well-developed work of Bowlby and attachment theory, and you get, again, robust replication there. And then you compare it to these other areas where you say, well, what's the overarching theoretical framework behind this? Well, there isn't. There's just a few previous experiments, and we've got sort of some ideas and constructs. It's like, that's going to fall apart. If you try to do that in any other science, they're going to tell you that's going to fall apart in 10 years. That's just going to fall apart. And I agree. I think that's exactly the problem. Psychologists are too hungry chasing after effects and not worrying about integrating explanations together. I mean, you know more about that than I do. I'm just telling you what I see.
No, it's my passion at two levels. One, in the sense that it's an enormous problem that's obvious if you look at it, and I'm amazed at how already sort of inoculated the system is against looking at it. Like, it's like, well, we thought about it, and then there's no problem, nothing to see here, even though, no, there's a problem. And it's like, well, but we decided to institutionalize over it through empirical methodology, so we'll look the other way, And then I guess there are really three things, because then the issue is, actually, there is a coherent underbelly here. At least that's my calling. And it's an unbelievably broad potential. And my connection to you broadens it out enormously. So I'm like, yes, there's a science of psychology. It organizes and it jumps over to psychotherapy. And actually, this is a huge space of confusion that if we can get organized, the amount of then potential organization, and the fact that then I can then go adjacent to your work and think about cognitive science, the meaning crisis, Eastern philosophy, and that intersection. And then it's just sort of like, you rotate that around and you see these two things come together. You see the academy and its floundering, and then you look out at the actual meaning crisis, right? The cultural status of what it's trying to look for, the emptiness of the soul-spirit dynamic, and the confusion with what science is. And you really see this incredible vortex of energy and vacuum and potential. It's a really fascinating. I mean, that's why I love being alive. It's wow, what a story.
But I mean, your point, and I know. I mean, I appreciate your enthusiasm as a co-theorist and researcher. But we also, I've also seen you tremendously moved by the suffering that all of this is creating. Right. I mean, and you know it in some ways even more intimately than I do, because you're a practicing psychotherapist. But, Christopher Mastropietro and I, we've talked about all the symptoms of the meaning crisis and how pervasive they are and how they're getting worse, and how that symptomology is so so sort of cognitively hamstringing us that we're just seeming incapable of turning to these really pressing environmental and socioeconomic and political issues that seem to be growing in their sort of extinction threat capabilities rapidly. And so that's why everything we're talking about here, and we do get interested in it, and that's good, because we're theorists and we like that. But everything we're talking about here is precisely not just, or not even primarily, an academic issue. We are academics, but we think this issue is not an academic issue. This is an existential, in both senses of the word, issue that needs to be fundamentally addressed. And so that's why talking about this stuff and trying to get the kind of clarity that you're pursuing is not, again, just a theoretical point. It's a point about trying. I mean, it sounds pretentious. It sounds full of hubris, but it's about trying to create, or help to create, participate in creating the kind of cultural frameworks that will save the world.
Totally. I mean, I know that. I mean, the hubris, there is that dynamic, but I will say the phenomenological, down to my cells clarity of both the is of the problem and the ought of the need for it to occur, allows me to be like, this is it. This is it. and I know that as my masculine theorist, physicist head, I mean, I can see this very clearly. And my feminist therapist heart, watching all the people suffer across all the different issues. There's the meaning and mental health crisis suffering, where people eat themselves alive in their souls and they don't know how to be grounded. And the opportunity, I mean, I feel so fortunate. I'm able to taste, experience, and glow. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm just alive and it's great. And, you have the right frame of reference. And so many people are eaten up inside by neurotic loops and reciprocal narrowing and just they lack encouragement and they don't know how to, and it's so easy to get stressed and overloaded. There's that. And then there's all the macro level structural problems that you speak to, and people like Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hall and all the other systematists. And the intersection of all that is, no, this is not an academic exercise. It's like, what the f- are we doing? Really in a big, big way.
So I wanted to put that on the table and really light it up, because, we're ultimately, we're going to be talking about sort of ontology and worldview. But the point about that is, again, the connection is the worldview is our ultimate home for where we will engage in the cognitive cultural practices and the cultural cognitive practices that will alleviate or help to alleviate all this suffering that we're talking about. So that's why your original question, I mean, I think we've unpacked it actually kind of nicely here about, can we come up with an ontology that sews things back together, that reintegrates in a way that affords the kind of individual and collective transformation that's going to alleviate suffering? That's exactly what I take your question to be.
That's exactly what the question is, because a huge amount of the suffering is the shriveling of the soul and spirit on the one hand, and it's a function of the overloaded, fragmented, chaotic system that's driving it in 6,000 different directions that leads, as I just listened to Zach's thing, and he was like, well, actually what this leads to is nihilism, narcissism, and chaos at the level of fundamental confusion. And
he's right to pair those two together. Sorry, absolutely. Go ahead, Greg.
No,
but I just want to,
And then that's what I see in us between me and you now. So there's two issues there. That's this bridge, or many issues, but it's a scientific humanistic bridge. It's the humanistic concern of the ontology of being, and I want to help people understand that, you can do all this cool stuff on quantum mechanics. It doesn't really matter that much in relationship to hanging out with your wife. There's an ontology of your life. Okay. There's ontology of your life in the periodic table. And we want to help people understand that those two things are different. And we can help individuals understand that we can opt into a scientific ontology, build a scientific ontology that goes from fundamental physical theories into chemical theories, into biological theories, into neurocognitive behavioral theories, into the emergence of anthropology, human psychology, and the cognitive cultural grammar of our histories, both ancient and modern to today, with a level of clarity and allow us to connect to a scientific ontology that and then draws our understanding to our subjective folk ontology in a way that enriches it rather than alienates and fragments it.
Exactly. That's beautifully well said. Yeah. So yeah, a way that, maybe even properly, especially we go back to the original etymology, that educates it, that draws forth from it and tutors it and helps to transform it in a way that is felt to not be trespassing on the autonomy of that our capacity, our soul, our capacity for realizing our proper place in the world.
Right.
So I think that's all very well said. And so how would you like to get there? Now, I think we've really set up the context of this very well together. I think we're getting into dialogos, the way things are really starting to weave and sew and emerge. So I think we've set the context really well. Where would you like to start? Now we've done a zoom out, or a zoom in,
Right,
about this issue around a kind of naturalism that revalorizes things like soul and spirit, wisdom and meaning. Those are the four I would like to talk about, but go ahead.
Beautiful. Well, let's actually, naturalism is a great place to start. If memory serves, your dissertation was on naturalism in science. Is that right?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, that's right.
So, so why don't let's start then, look at sort of the Enlightenment. Let's look at the concept of science, physicalism, naturalism, relative to dual worldviews, and see if you and I are in are in agreement on some of the diagnoses of what the problems are.
Right.
And the reason I put coherent naturalism is because I think that there's a general sort of common sense naturalism that a lot of scientists and philosophers abide by, and that with good reason.
It's incoherent.
But it's incoherent. It doesn't jive, and it certainly doesn't jive on the matter-mind problem, like what is mind? So if we can go back maybe naturalism and then frame mind, and then we can get into things like wisdom and other kinds of. How does that sound?
That sounds great. So I would maybe like to. We could begin by maybe proposing how we're going to use it, and do some dialectic around it, what we're going to mean by this term naturalism.
Perfect.
Because what I hear you saying, and I'm in agreement with this, is, we have sort of a concept, but we need to really educate it because it's not coherent ultimately, and it's not set up to handle this problem that you and I are talking about here. So, yeah, you're right. I did my dissertation way back in the before times. We had just discovered fire on what I call the naturalistic imperative in cognitive science. And I was influenced by a bunch of people, and sort of, let me give sort of a standard thing, and then how I was already trying to inflect it, and maybe that will serve as a bridge. So the standard model of naturalism is that when you do something, like you're proposing a particular theory or even set of entities, right? That you do it in a way that is consistent with the natural sciences. And so, first of all, we need to pause there, because naturalism is not the same thing, therefore, right from the beginning with reductionism. So reductionism is the claim that everything that you're going to say can ultimately be replaced by, reduced to, the entities and the forces and the processes within physics.
Let's call that physical reductionism. Okay?
Physical
or physicalism or physical reductionism. That's the term I generally use, and I'm definitely fighting hard against physical reductionism as one of the things. I'll also use the term materialistic flatland. I borrow Ken Wilber there. That's another angle on that.
Okay, so so let's go in there. So I also have got arguments and reasons deeply influenced, even going back to Jerry Fodor, on which I think philosophically and historically reductionism is bankrupt. And so now that doesn't immediately license idealism or dualism or magicalism or supernaturalism, because there's a big difference between saying anything I propose has to be consistent with the natural science from saying everything I propose has to be reducible to the existing natural sciences. Because if you continually followed that, there wouldn't be chemistry and there wouldn't be biology, right? And we're trying to turn psychology into a science, and that means it's not going to be biology, it's not going to be chemistry, it's not going to be physics. It's going to be consistent with it. We're not going to propose things that are well, to my mind at least, that are ultimately inconsistent with.
So yeah, there's vertical consistency, and that vertical suggests some kind of hierarchy, and we can talk some about that.
Yes.
Daniel Dennett has a nice analysis in Darwin's Dangerous Idea. Good reductionism basically is this vertical consistency. Greedy reductionism is the deconstruction of the layers to the layers beneath them that obliviate the other layers. So I certainly do want to, as a naturalist, I would say that I am anchored to and positioned to be consistent with the physical sciences, definitely. But I would also say that there is no way that the explanatory grammar of physics and the descriptive grammar of physics is up to the task in any way, shape, or form for the level of analysis that I'm operating on.
I agree with that, but I don't know if you'll agree with this next move, although I made a similar argument to the before and you seem to like it. So most people understand that epistemically, like you just said, here's the epistemological grammar, it's inadequate. And I don't deny any of that, but I take a stronger stance. I think that I don't even think that, I take an ontological stance. I also resist. I think that there's a hierarchy to being itself, if you want to put it that way. Mm-hmm. And that goes, that's influenced by, some of the stuff coming out of speculative realism, object-oriented ontology, discussions about, different kinds of objects. Morton's talk about hyperobjects. We can go into some of those in detail if you want. The basic argument goes something like this. But wait. It can't be just an epistemic thing we're talking about, because if the gauges and my eyes and my brain and the language I'm using don't really exist, then all of the conclusions I'm drawing about the bottom basement level of my ontology also don't really exist. Beautiful. And then how does that science, the science, look at in the ontological basement, the particles are identical, the forces are the same, the laws are equivalent, but the science depends on information. It depends on differences. It depends on measurement. It depends on real objects measuring real patterns. Another idea from Daniel Dennett, right? And so I think it's not only an epistemic difference or even epistemological difference we're talking about when we're resisting reductionism. I'm also saying, no, that's pointing to something deep about a misconception in our ontology.
Exactly.
I think ontology is also richer.
This is Roy Bhaskar, as a critical realist, Roy Bhaskar basically makes this case. And I find my system allied quite nicely. The underlying ontoepistemology of the ontic reality very much aligns with Roy Bhaskar's critical realism. And that is the stratification of nature is not an epistemological entity, it's an ontological entity.
Exactly. Exactly.
And really, I would say that's actually what we have on our scientific knowledge is an onto-epistemological understanding of the actual ontic reality.
Yes.
Actually. Yes. So I then cluster onto-epistemology as our beliefs about the ontic reality.
Excellent. I think that's good language. And so for me, what that means is we have to take seriously not only the relationship between the different disciplines, we have to take seriously the ontological relationship between the different ontic levels. And figure out, and of course your work points towards this, and how do we figure out bottom-up emergence and what does that look like? And top-down emanation, and what does that look like? And notice the language is starting to sound very Neoplatonic, and I don't think that's a mistake, and I don't think that's just happening by happenstance. I think there's deep reasons why we find ourselves moving back into that kind of language. So for me, we have this rich view. Now, in fact, I like the fact that you call it naturalism. I also want to distinguish it from materialism. I'm going to make a rather bold claim. I don't think anybody's a materialist, at least in the sciences. I haven't met a materialist.
Okay.
I take materialism to be the claim that what ultimately exists is matter. And that's, We haven't really believed that for a very long time. We think there's matter and energy, space and time. We think there are causal relationships. We think there are real structures. Given my previous argument, those structural functional organizations are real. We think information is real. We think knowledge is real. What would it be to say that knowledge doesn't really exist because it's not made out of quarks? That's a bizarre and weird thing. Well, it's ultimately made out of quarks. No, it's not. The knowledge qua knowledge is not made out of quarks, right? It's the pattern in the quarks, right? And with not only the pattern of the quarks, but the pattern of the pattern of the patterns, right? Right? And so, and when we start talking, when we start talking about things like evolution, I think evolution is a real thing. Is it a material entity? Well, it's not an object. It doesn't have a spatio-temporal location, right? It's right.
Yep.
And this is, and Morton talks a lot about that in hyper objects. Like, we're talking like global warming. Is that a real thing? Well, it sure is. Where is it located?
Right.
Right. Okay. And so trying to talk about as if the world is made up of spatio-temporal lumps of stuff, and that's ultimately all that there is. I don't know anybody in any science many scientists will self-declare as materialists, but I don't think they know what they're talking about. That's the incoherence you're talking about. That's not the ontology. We have dynamical systems. We have autopoietic things. We have evolution of living things. Like, my gosh, we are way beyond a materialist ontology, especially if we have abandoned reductionism.
Okay. All right. So now let me pick that up and see how you jive with this on. So let me lay out the ontology of the TOK. Okay.
Okay. Please.
So tree of knowledge it situates itself as a theory of scientific knowledge. Okay. So it's about knowledge, and then it's a theory about scientific knowledge. All right. Where scientific knowledge, as you said, is actually then in the culture person plane of existence, which actually is these propositional legitimizing statements. Okay. Right. So scientific as systems of justification, where the epistemology is empiricism, and then the scientific ontology refers to the ontological claims about the ontic reality.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
And then what we decide in sort of a Platonic justified true belief, whereby we build a scientific model, we empirically test it with a scientific epistemology, and then we say, oh, that's reality. Here's the periodic table of the elements. That's a set of ontological claims that have been justified through the empirical method or in scientific epistemology that then maps onto the ontic reality.
Right.
So it's actually an ontological interpretation of Plato's justified true belief.
Right.
And it places the human knower in the universe knowing about shit.
Right.
Okay? And then it places modern science in a particular kind of historical justification. Okay. And I was just reminded, and I'm more than ever, I'm like, well, actually, I'm an American psychologist. And what I mean by that is I was just listening to the history of some Islamic scholar, and I'm like, I don't know anything about Islamic scholars. Right. These guys with these theories and notions and everything. It's like, oh, that's a whole set of systems of justification I know nothing about, So it's just, it's humbling at some level. I'm always humbled by how little I know. Anyway, but within the modern scientific, by that I mean Galileo into Newton into what becomes sort of the Enlightenment scientific natural science enterprise, right? You and I are in the same basic ballpark there. So, and then what happens with that system is that it begins to map. And the first thing it maps is matter in motion. So the first paradigmatic mapping is Newton building calculus and mapping matter in motion. Right. And this then becomes a particular kind of exemplar of scientific ontology, epistemology kind of notion. Okay. And then we add Kant, who then adds the human epistemological, phenomenological blend to that. So he's like, well, we have the categories of mind and we're perceiving matter in motion. And then somehow we have a human epistemological sense-making of the phenomenological nomina that's a matter in motion that is somehow tied together in a rational empirical way, but it never gets synthesized. Okay. Then what I would say is then what happens is then there are all these possible, you get Herbert Spencer, you get all those systematizers, but none of them really work. Our lineage, I think both of our lineage actually, is really an emergent naturalism. Okay. And the emergent naturalists in the 1920s, like Conrad Lloyd Morgan, a comparative psychologist of all things, built an emergent naturalist sort of movement, but they can't get a foothold in it because there's so many different versions. This is the problem, that an emergent naturalism, you can map the territory in lots of different ways, and it doesn't create an amenable test, or at least they couldn't figure out ways to create amenable testing. Okay.
Right.
So then logical empiricism comes along, tries to cut the legs out from this and reduce everything, building off of early Wittgenstein and Bertrand Russell. And they basically then are like, well, we're just going to have statements of fact and empirical facts, and we're going to logic and empiricism, well, that blows up, obviously. Okay.
Right.
So what I think we're in the process of is we're revitalizing an emergent naturalism. Okay.
Yes, I agree.
So then the tree of knowledge comes along, and what the tree of knowledge does do is it locates the history of the problem of psychology. It says, okay, you have a matter-mind problem. You have Kant phenomenology and Newtonian matter and motion, and nobody ever figured out a way to put that stuff together. And so we got so many different. Well, but now an updated 21st century emergent naturalism is possible. That's what that actually is, a coherent emergent naturalism. Okay. And what the tree of knowledge says is that we can now trace with Big Bang, quantum mechanics and general relativity at the physical level, we can drop to the core ontological singularity, what I call a pure energy information singularity at the Big Bang. Okay. Right. And what I mean by that is you get space, time, energy, matter, and information all clustered together into a mathematical quasi-singularity, but an undifferentiated, and what I would call, I don't know if you know Bohm, and I like this to be thought of as an energy information implicate order, okay, that then is going to create the ultimate glue field, all right, that then is going to emanate and emerge, there'll be a phase transition between the photons and gluons, and then that's going to create a phase transition that then accelerates a differentiated process of a pure energy information into and gives rise to the emergent material dimension of complexity originally.
Right. Okay.
So then we go from pure energy information then into particle field differentiation. All right. And this is very consistent with quantum field theory. Quantum relativistic field theory basically then characterizes particles and fields, particles and forces as disturbance is in a quantum relativistic field. That's an energy information. Okay. Right. And then, the interaction of the forces and fields that are disturbances in the energy information field then have emergent properties because they then have aggregate and differentiated form.
Yep.
Okay? And then when they expand to the point, then you get an organized electromagnetic around the hydrogen and helium processes. You get the atomic level of emergence. So we go from layer 0, which is the singularity of energy information, into the first floor, which is the particles, and that gets mapped by the standard theory of elementary particle physics. And that happens in the first, portion of a second. And then the portion of a second goes and there's a massive explanation. And then that inflation gives rise to the atomic layer, okay, which is mostly helium and hydrogen and a little bit of lithium. All right. But this is before then stars. And then you get the explosion of the cosmic microwave background radiation. Okay. And that 380,000, and because you get energy matter decoupling, the plasma system shifts and it expands. And then boom, you get photonic, the echo of the cosmic microwave background radiation.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you get expansion. And now you get the formation of stars and galaxies. Okay. And then there's at least in our history, then there's basically a 10 billion year, hiatus and pause, and stars are blowing up to create heavier elements, okay, that then organize in certain kinds of planets. And then you fast forward to life. You fast forward to planet Earth at 4 billion years that has a very complicated chemistry as a function of the explosion of stars and other kinds of elements or stars giving rise to various kinds of heavy elements that get attracted to our particular place, okay? And now you have complicated material arrangements that have, and what we see then is what I would call weak emergence across these levels, which are aggregates of parts that then have properties that then the properties of those forms interact and they create new kinds of forms. So we need particle physics, we need atomic physics, we need chemistry, and we need large scale material physics to map things like planets and stars and things like that.
That's great.
That's all. We're all okay. So, and then this is the material dimension that has emerged out of the energy information. And even here, it's not just matter, it's really energy information unfolding.
Yes.
Right. And then there's the huge jump, a qualitative, strong, I call it strongly emergent, the strongly emergent jump into life.
Yes.
Right? And with the strongly emergent jump into why? Because you get complex dynamic systems with an energy information process, there's an information processing storage function, right? It metabolizes energy and then it communicates. You get cell-cell communication.
Right,
and it is all of the network of information processing, complex and dynamic active behavior, autopoietic, all that stuff. And those have causal top-down implications for how things move. You had a friend you talked to me about, you said he explored the various, if I heard this correctly, he was exploring the causal implications of purpose or teleonomic behavior or things along those lines, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And this is, so now, and the tree of knowledge then maps this as a fundamentally different kind of jump. Okay. And philosophers will talk about supervenience. I'm talking about, no, there's actually, and this is what I really want to, nail down and see. So I think that basically what you get, one way to think about it is functional formal causation, final causation, functional final causation, or formal whatever. If you go back to the way Galileo cut off Aristotle's metaphysics, he left kinetic and substance, you had to have matter in motion, but he killed final and formal causation. But those are actually my dog's running about here. My dog's running around behaving very differently than my table, right?
Right.
So then and what's unique about you talked about information. What's unique about cells is that they store information, they process information, they communicate information into cell networks, right?
Yep.
So would you be keen then, or so that we get weak emergence, and then the jump from chemistry to biology is actually a form of strong emergence?
Yeah.
I don't know about that term, but
well, it depends.
Different kind of emergence.
So I think you're pointing to something that I agree with. I'm not sure if the language is the same. Okay. So when I talk about this in the cognitive science, there's the philosophical distinction between weak emergence and strong emergence is this kind of distinction. In weak emergence, I can give an explanation of the relationship between the components in the gestalt. Mm-hmm. So water is wet, hydrogen and oxygen aren't. But that's not a mystery. I know I can explain to you the process by which hydrogen and oxygen interact, why a particular structure emerges, and why that structure has powers, right? Causal interactions that the components don't have.
Yeah.
Strong emergence, which was advocated by people like C.D. Broad and others, is right that the upper layer emerges, but there is no way of explaining how it emerges. Yep. And so this is often the kind of emergence that is invoked by property dualists who want to say that there's a kind of dualism. It's not a substance dualism. There's a kind of dualism here. And in everything you've said, I would call all of that weak emergence in this philosophical sense, because in the sense that
Yep. No, I've had this exact same problem in my head. So go.
But wait. I don't want. I'm not trying to be dismissive.
No, I don't.
You're right to point out, like, there's an issue, and it's like the phase transitions in matter. There's a point at which differences in degree become differences in kind.
Yep.
Right. And I think I understand what you're trying to do. I'm just saying that the language for me is jarring, because it's not the same mapping of the way those terms are used in the philosophy of mind. But what I hear you saying is there's a fundamental difference in kind between the way, various chemical processes can be self-organizing, and how an autopoietic thing is not just self-organizing, it's self-making. And it's self-organized such that it seeks out the conditions that produce and protect and promote its own existence. So it has an inner teleology. It acts on purpose because it is taking care of itself. It cares about different states of the world in a motivationally relevant way. That's what I hear you saying. And I think, so when I think about that, and as opposed to reductionism and trying to get that, both the continuity and the important difference, that's where Evan Thompson, maybe that's the friend you were alluding to, his idea of deep continuity comes in, right? That there's deep continuity between the self-organizing thing and the autopoietic thing, because the autopoietic thing is a species of self-organizing, but there's also deep and important differences. And then what he goes on to say is, of course, that there's a deep continuity between being a living thing and being a cognitive thing. They're not identical, they're not reducible. There's an important difference there. But it's not that metaphysical strong emergence that is, I find, very problematic because.
Okay, I'm glad we're talking about this because I'm writing about it. I'm struggling with exactly these issues because I don't want to. Here's what and so maybe we can actually have a dialogos here because this actually be really helpful. Okay, so here's. I'll lay out then the case. It's depicted in the vision logic of the tree of knowledge. Okay, the vision logic of the tree of knowledge depicts the evolution and complexification of nature across time. Okay, and it shows the complexification of within dimension activity. So matter goes from particles into atoms into chemistries across scale, and that is captured by this emergent complexification variance entity. That's what at least it's mapping. Okay. But then there is an S curve of popping, a thing pops out of it that we can then trace back into Luca, the last common ancestor or whatever, or the emergence of life, whereby there is there's definitely a evolutionary continuity, but there's a complexity building feedback loop that builds a metabolic information processing communication network that creates a complex adaptive landscape that is qualitatively different in the jump from chemistry to life than the jump was from atoms to chemistry, atoms to molecules.
I agree with everything. I agree with that, all of that perfectly.
So then the question is, or I guess my thing, but interesting to get the same language on how I backed off. I was writing about strong emergence. I had a conversation with somebody else. Don't use strong emergence. So now it's like, well, all right. Yeah, no. And I was trying to because I was so annoyed with the reductionists. I was like, I'll go with it. And I was like, maybe I don't want to, anchor myself into something I don't believe, because there's an ontological continuity, certainly. And so, but there is a fundamental difference in relation to the within dimension, but relative to between. And I can specify that it's the complexity for all three, meaning from matter to life, life to mind, and mind to culture on the UTOK. Each one of them is represented by the emergence, an evolutionary emergence of a complexity building feedback loop that generates a complex adaptive landscape that's mediated by novel information processing systems within and communication between. So that's the kind of, I need a word for that kind of emergence.
Yeah, and so we need to try and craft one together because, and I get the intuition for, it's very analogous to Searle's weak and strong AI, and you're trying to do something like that with those. But yeah, unfortunately, the terms are taken, and they have well-established traditions behind them. Because, and the reason why it mattered in philosophy is people are often guilty of equivocating between what the philosophers call weak emergence and strong emergence, right? Water emerges from hydrogen and oxygen, it's a totally different thing. And the immaterial soul emerges from the material properties of the brain in exactly the same way. And it's it's exactly not the same way, right? Because, I have an explanation of how hydrogen and oxygen become water. I don't have an explanation about how parts of the brain interact to produce an immaterial soul or something like that. And people engage in that kind of equivocation all the time. And you want to prevent that because it's fallacious, it's misleading. But again, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You are right to point to, but the thing between hydrogen and oxygen, there's deep similarities between that emergence and the emergence from non-living things to living things. That's why I like Evan's term. There's a continuity there. There's a similarity, but continuity also means not only are there relevant similarities, there are relevant differences. So I don't know what kind of emergence to call that. I mean, I guess I'd be tempted to say sort of deep continuity emergence or something, but it's not quite getting what you want.
Well, right, I backed off and went with, right now I'm going with within dimension and between dimension emergence. So that's pretty, if I just use the vision logic of the TOK, so within is within matter, and then between is, from matter to life. So that's currently where I've landed.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like it's sort of a viable stipulation, right? So, I mean, what you typically do in deep continuity is you say, well, here's the vertical similarity, right? Both autopoietic things and fire and the paramecium are both self-organizing things, but here's the difference. Here's the relevant difference. Fire does not self-organize such that it will seek out the conditions that produce, protect, and promote it. The paramecium does. And that is a relevant difference because in order to explain the paramecium, I have to understand its internal caring, like sense making, things like that. Yes.
That's right. And one of the things I discovered in the embedded logic of the TOK is there's continuity in the way in which the different dimensions emerge. In other words, that life emerges out of matter through a complexity building feedback loop that builds information processing communication, and actually same with mind when we get into what is mind, and the same thing with culture. And that then now we actually have, and actually I believe the same thing maybe with matter and energy. That's a whole nother set of issues. And if that happens, then you got deep continuity back with discontinuity.
But that's exactly right. And pointing that out, I think, is very good. That you've got sort of higher order continuity between the kinds of relations you're specifying in this kind of emergence. I think that's right. I think that's very good. It's very powerful. Notice how deep continuity allows the similarities constrain you to be consistent with the physics, but the differences mean that you are committed to not carrying out any kind of reductionism. That's the whole point of this kind of hypothesis of deep continuity. And if we agree that the deep continuity is not just epistemic, but ontic, then we're committed to the fact, and this is where I guess I want to talk to you a bit about, because I think one of the defining things is, right, like you get emergence up, but you have emanation down, right? The idea that because the paramecium is organized the way it does, it swims around in a particular predictable pattern. It swims away from things that it senses as poison. Chemicals aren't poison in and of themselves. That doesn't make any sense, right? And it swims towards chemicals that it regards as food. I'm not saying consciously regards, that's ridiculous, right? But and so it's doing, and I can't explain its behavior without invoking poison and food and the fact that it's a living thing, right? And so what that means is the way the matter is moving through space and time in the paramecium requires these higher level structural functional organization. Why is the matter moving this way? Well, it's moving this way because the paramecium is trying to avoid poison and obtain food. Now, is that in any way inconsistent with the underlying chemistry? No, but chemistry doesn't have an ontology of food or poison. You look all you want through chemistry and you won't get the ontological entities food and poison. But I need those in order to explain why the paramecium is moving the way it is, which ultimately explains why is this piece of matter and energy located here in space and time.
Actually, this gives me a really interesting idea. I built this thing called the periodic table of behavior. We talked a little bit about it, but essentially what it does is as follows. And the reason I'm sorry I didn't interrupt you, but we can come back to this in terms of. Here's the two associations that I had off of what you were saying. I'm also reading David Douche recently. He did and he's definitely not a reductionist. He's got a multi-verse thing that I'm trying to wrap my head around, which I don't really buy. But he loves. The level of a good explanation is an ontological, essentially, level for him. And that, in other words, he has the knowledge. Okay, so here you were saying is, hey, and this is what he would say also, and what I would say in relationship to justification. We build knowledge systems that are corresponding to particular levels, particular kinds of behavior, object field change that we observe and functionally map. And then those patterns, those functional structural relations, we construct explanations for in relation, and they're required to have sense making. Okay.
Yep.
So here's the prediction. If that's the case, then we actually should be able to align the kinds of explanations that we have in order across the levels and dimensions. Okay. Yes. Meaning, and we should be able to maybe move up one or down one, but moving more than that starts to create real problems. So you can actually then align the kind of vocabulary that people use with a predicted analysis that emerges out of the periodic table of behavior. And what the predicted analysis is that there is a foundational whole, which then gives rise to a part and group relation. So you get three different levels of analysis, part, whole, group, across scale for each of the different dimensions. Okay?
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah. So you get particle, atom, molecule across scale all the way up to a galaxy. All right. Right. Then you move over, you get gene, cell, multi-cell across up to ecology for biology. Okay. Then you get neural net, animal mind, group mind, okay, groups of animals across behavioral ecologies. All right. Then you get justification, human person, groups of people across. Okay. So then you get culture. Exactly. So then each one of these then has that gives rise to 12 different floors. The first floor is particle physics. Okay. The second floor is atomic matter, then chemistry, then out to scale. Then you get genetics, you get cytology, you get botany and mycology, the fungi study. Then you get neuroscience, and then you get the core of ethology, comparative psychology, and then sociobiology. And then you get human cognitive science, you get human psychology, and then you get the social sciences. All of those. What activated my thought was that if what you were saying is that we apply these systems of justification, which is exactly what I would say, or whatever language you want to use, that are then operative across the level, then they should maybe hold +1 and -1 in terms of their utility. But if we jump, you cannot do quantum mechanics of this conversation. That's just absolutely insane. Right? There's no sense to be had between that knowledge system and this knowledge system.
Right, because science depends on inductive generalizations, which depend on identity claims, and deep continuity says what you actually have is, and I think this is an ontological factor, we maybe come back to it, what you actually have between the levels is you have an important similarity and differences. And the problem with similarities, deep continuity, is similarity is ultimately not transitive. So I can't generalize all the way across because the identities are being gradually overwhelmed by the differences as I move between the levels. Now, I think that points to our fundamental issue, which is that, I mean, whenever we're doing anything epistemic, we're ultimately confronting similarity. And what we're doing is making judgments about whether or not we're going to treat that similarity as an identity or a difference.
Okay.
And so when we treat it as an identity, we claim the identity is more relevant and therefore we can generalize. And when we don't, we treat it, we say the difference is more relevant and therefore, and here's the point I want to make. And this is, I think, a devastating argument against reductionism, because reductionism was ultimately claiming that ultimately, ontologically, the identities are real and the differences are not. That would mean that there is a logic or an algorithm for deciding similarity. And we've had arguments for a very long time showing there is no such thing.
Fascinating.
Because if I drop to logic, and this is Goodman's point from way back in the 70s, if I drop to logic, any two objects are, share properties to an unlimited number or don't share properties to an unlimited number. And we decide which are the relevant, ones we want to compare or not when we make judgments of similarities. There's no algorithm for this. There's no logic of similarity. And therefore trying to claim ontologically that somehow we should always be choosing these identities within the similarities that reality presents to us, I think is a fallacious point. It's a fallacious point.
Yeah, no, that certainly makes, that's not an angle that I have taken, but that certainly makes good sense to me.
So what dip continuity does for me is it's an epistemological position that gives priority to similarity over identity and difference. And then it says you have to take that as the primary sort of touching point between your ontology and your epistemology, and you have to construct your epistemology and your ontology accordingly.
All right. So if we can, all right, that makes good sense. Have you encountered or have you developed any vocabulary? If we go back to the difference between the jumps between, within a dimension, okay,
Yep.
to the jumps between the dimensions, if we're going to use that.
Yep.
Have you encountered or have you internalized that distinction, and then B, a way of framing it that resonates with your own sense-making?
What I would say is, you're doing and I mean this as a compliment, and you know it because you're my friend, right? You're doing the Aristotelian project of something like the Great Chain of Being, which is both an Aristotelian and a Neoplatonic project, by the way.
We're doing Neo-Aristotelian Platonic stuff here, John.
Yeah. Because we're ultimately trying to see the connection between it. We're trying to find, because intelligibility is both an epistemological thing and an ontological thing. And that's what we're trying to talk about here. We're trying to talk about the ontology of intelligibility as that, right, that is simultaneously shared by, our ontology and our epistemology. But what I have a specific species of the more generic problem that you're tackling. And so this is the problem that arises in cognitive science. Now, where it starts is it might seem like a weird place, but it starts in what's called the simulation problem. How can I distinguish between a mere simulation of cognition and an actual instance of it? And this, of course, is highly relevant in the whole debate about strong AI versus weak AI and things like that. And a friend and colleague of mine, Chris, there's a long argument here, and there's reasons why the Turing test won't decide this, and blah, 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 blah. Very good reasons, by the way, because the Turing test actually presupposes a solution to the problem rather than actually affording it. And if you want to talk about that sometime, I'm happy to come back and talk about that. But my friend Chris Green pointed out that why we can't decide this is because we don't have what he calls the criterion of the cognitive. Some people call it the mark of the mental. I like the criterion of the cognitive because it's a little bit more precise, because the mental includes the conscious and the unconscious, and that it's problematic. And he says this, but we notice the difference between a criterion and a definition. We'll only have a definition of matter when physics is complete. And I'm a Persian. I don't think we'll ever complete that. It'll always be like, converging towards the ever retreating horizon, which is fine. But the thing is, we have a criterion, right? So one of the things we did in the scientific revolution is and one of the ways we sort of broke, and I really like Aristotle, so you know that I'm saying this in an affectionate way. One of the ways we broke kind of a death grip and afforded to science is, right, we made this distinction between natural things and things that were created on purpose. And that was part of what Galileo was doing. And I agree with you, it's problematic. But what that did was it allowed us to see that a lot of the universe is not behaving teleologically. Now, we might be making the wrong conclusion and saying that none of it is. We can come back to that. But we discovered that, wow, actually, a lot of the universe isn't happening teleologically. That's why having organisms, agents that perform teleologically is a fundamental difference.
Totally.
Right? And so the thing that's going on there, right, is we have a criterion of the cognitive, right, which is we have a criterion of the physical. The physical is the non-teleological, blah, blah. This is how we pick it out, how we get it, how we create what's called systematic import, how we carve up the world into categories that will have stable properties that allow us to make the inductive generalizations that science seeks.
Totally.
Now, the problem with that is we don't have a corresponding criterion of the cognitive. We don't have, give me some, I know you have a proposal, but I'm trying to show. No, this is great. Brilliant. Yep. We don't have a, and this is Green's point, we don't have a criterion of the cognitive? Well, cognition is that which uses representations. There's lots of bona fide, intellectually respected cognitive scientists will say, no, we don't use representations, right? Well, it's information processing. That doesn't pick out cognition. There's information processing happening all over the place, all over the universe. That's not what we mean. Oh, well, it requires consciousness. No, it doesn't. We think a lot of our own cognition, et cetera. And so what we have is we have all these proposals, right, that have fallen by the wayside. So, and then a good friend of mine, Dan Chiappi, and a professor we both shared, Andy Kukla, said, well, the problem why we can't get a criterion of the cognitive is, right, is that we can't carve the mind at its joints. We can't figure out how to get it in a way in which we can see how it functions, how it works. And that this is the famous frame problem in cognitive science, because every piece of information is potentially relevant to every other piece, and and potentially relevant to your action. But this is the problem that I care about. This is the problem that I call the problem of relevance realization.
Yep.
So I made a proposal, which is this: we keep using all these other criteria of the cognitive, and we keep bumping into the problem of relevance realization. And ultimately, and you and I both, you helped me to think of this more as recursive relevance realization, and I thank you for that. And I said, well, why don't we do the reverse? Why don't we take relevance realization as the criterion and then try to explain all the other things from it?
Yep.
And so I'm proposing that relevance realization is the criterion of the cognitive, that what picks out cognitive things from non-cognitive things is a capacity for recursive relevance realization. And so in a very real sense, that's a species of the thing you've been talking about, because it's like, well, because here's what I mean. Here's why we run into this problem. Because if I try to explain relevance realization using mental terms, I'll make the homuncular fallacy. Totally. I'll just explaining it. I need to explain the cognitive emerging out of non-cognitive processes, or I'm just going to be giving a circular explanation. Right. But I need the cognitive processes to be relevantly different from the non-cognitive processes from which they emerge. I argue that something very analogous about how evolution works. I don't need to get into the specifics right now. You and I have talked at length about this, but that's exactly
right.
I've bumped into this, and I've internalized the problem exactly that way.
So, okay, so now let's then watch our systems then do this thing that they do, which is really, really cool. Okay. Right. So, yes, I bitch all the time about what the hell does cognitive mean? What does mind mean? What does behavior mean? Right. Okay. So then I stumble on the tree of knowledge, and this 4-cone thing with these joints actually sets the stage for, especially I'm stuck inside the problem of psychology, this joint thing between life and mind. Okay. Is what's actually what Skinner, I hated Skinner for a while, and then I got because I was a cognitivist, and then I fell into what he was actually saying, which actually operant theory basically is Skinner's behavior, essentially. So for Skinner, which is then basically the environment creates the contingencies, and then there's a commerce, so he originally described it, with the animal, and then that commerce exchange is what pulls the animal in whatever behavioral selection path that it finds itself on.
Exactly.
You know, and then there's the whole problem of where you get into animals, and then you go from the primates to persons, right? Okay. And then the TOK says, actually, just like there's a modern evolutionary synthesis, okay, that's natural selection operating on genetic combinations across the generations, there's behavioral selection that's operating on the neurocognitive structure, okay, that then builds animals with brains and complex active bodies moving around in the world, doing all the things that we call mental, okay? So then I was like, well, and then this thing called mind now, capital M mind, is the third dimension of complexity. It corresponds to what animal behavior. It explodes onto the world at the Cambrian explosion, basically. I mean, there's shit before that, but they're not really complex active bodies with not brains. They're jellyfish and little worms and, planarians right on the base. And then it explodes into like crabs. Okay. Right. So, all right. So then what did I call this? I was like, well, I can see this as a bridge between behaviorism and a base simplistic neurocognitive functionalism.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Neurocognitive functionalism. What did I mean by that? Well, I jammed in all the cognitive terms. It's like, well, it's an information processing system that engages some kind of predictive processing that creates an information integrated network that creates semantic stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
That's, what the cognitive people mean.
Yeah. Totally,
Okay?
totally.
Mediated by the nervous system that then has the overt activity of the agent arena environment relation. Right. And then that's just a cognitive then is a placeholder. Okay.
Yes.
Until I'm walking down my goddamn dog, listening to relevance realization, right? And I'm like, what is the functional structural organization of that information processing that's embedded in the nervous system?
Right. Right.
Boom. And then what that does then is it takes this whole, we'll talk about plugging stuff together without circular definitions. It takes an entire other line of development, right? And then inserts it into the system. And then when I'm like, oh my God, I'm doing behavioral investment theory, mostly from a Skinner with a neurocognitive switch. Now I switch right back into the first person perspective across recursive relevance realization and shoot up into human cognitive neuroscience, cognitive science. It's like, boom.
Exactly. And I mean, and we did a lot of that, especially in Untangling the World Knot, where we sew those two together and we make, I think, together a plausible claim of how you can go up from the neurocognitive functional level up to the consciousness, which
right then all of a sudden we get it integrated. Now there's a focal, and now it's an embodied base of sentience. And then you pop into an adverbial viewer of an adjectival experience, and then you get a self-modeling, and then you get a narrative and propositional language, and oh goddamn, we have a coherent naturalist ontology, John, that can restore the human soul and spirit.
I think so. I think that's exactly right. I mean, so part of the work that needs to be done still, though, is to how relevance may map into meaning. I think I can make a good argument for how it maps into meaning in life, the existential meaning, somewhat of an argument about how it maps into semantic meaning. And then I think in terms of that, we also want to talk about, how we can ground notions like self-transcendence, how we can ground notions of, finding a proper home or place. And maybe we can get notions of spirit out of that grounded notion of self-transcendence, soul out of that, that grounded notion of belonging, fittedness, proper placeness, and things like that. So, I mean, we're exploring this in the new series we're going to release with Chris, The Elusive Eye, because we want to try and talk. So there's this intermediary entity even within psychology. I think I was reading one article which the most cited construct and the least explained construct in all of psychology, which is the self.
Mm-hmm.
And the self, in some sense, mediates in a way that we need to explicate, the three of us together, and hopefully also with the help of many other people contributing it. It somehow mediates in this deep continuity way we've been talking about between mind and terms like spirit and terms like soul. And I think getting the proper explication of the relationship between mind and self and between self and spirit and soul, I think that's a central task. And I think if we can make some progress on that, I think that will feed back into making more plausible this kind of naturalism that we seem to be agreeing on, that we're proposing together.
All right, so let's as we begin to wrap this up, let's say this is to me it's a beautiful journey. I mean,
right.
It's a beautiful journey, and so I think we're in agreement that the ontological, philosophical, scientific understanding that comes off the Enlightenment is basically broken and chaotic with regards to giving us a coherent ontology, a coherent naturalistic ontology, right? And I think that, what then emerges between us and synergy and other people around us, but there's a real unique synergy here with your cognitive science philosophy and my psychology, psychotherapy reality here.
Right.
We cover a lot of territory, and to the extent that there is a lock and key function, which I would just, which we were just embodying. Okay. Then you have now the issue is, well, okay, each of us or whatever in our communities, and then it's sort of like, okay, if we can bring communities that actually can carve away and, keep me from making a mistake on my strong emergence or whatever, but to see if the architecture of understanding is there and the synergy holds, and as you get into it with other collective intelligence pieces, the resonance of coherence holds, okay, then you actually have a emerging transcendental beacon that hooks into the natural science worldview. And then if if there's the deep theoretical work, we have to define mind, we have to define psychology, mind, behavior, cognition, self, and then into soul and spirit,
Yeah.
And then if we have those kinds of frames, the criterion for them, the clarity about talking about them, and then the bridge to then what that means in relationship to the practices and the belonging in the community, the re-establishment of a connective, nourishing flow between our worldviews and each other is, to me, what revitalizes the soul spirit.
I think that's good. An idea came to me. What about calling that kind of emergence you want to put your finger to consilient emergence?
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, certainly, the whole term unified does come from consilience. That's actually where the term unified emerges from. So, and certainly that is the emergent emanation. Actually, I was actually catching as to whether or not because there's a particular kind of new information emanation.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a emergent emanative loop that's when you were speaking before, I was like, oh, it's like I am speaking to an emergent emanative feedback loop in a little way that's different than within when I'm talking between than within. I actually caught my ear. That's interesting. But that's I will be mulling over the various terms, and I'll be undoubtedly texting you in a hypomanic state of excitement at some point.
That's good. I look forward to those texts.
So, all right, friend. Well, I think this is a pretty good time for us to
I agree.
Bring this conversation. Thank you so much for your time and your this to me. I thought there was a couple of certainly I felt a couple of jolts of potential dialogos about what might be happening here.
Places, for sure.
And certainly good dialogue and dialectic exchange.
Yeah, very much.
All right. Well, I enjoyed it a lot, and
I wish you all success on this podcast. I hope. I hope it flourishes.
Thank you. Well, I certainly appreciate you talking with Gregg. So there it is. All right.